I'm Tiffany. Welcome to Towering TBR. If you're new, I am a chronically ill and disabled booktuber who reads a wide variety of genres, although sci-fi and nonfiction are my favorite. You will see the variety of what I read in the month of July because there was just so many things that I read. If you could, please like the video and subscribe if you aren't already subscribed. That way you can catch all of my bookish videos. In July, I participated in Chattie's readathon, Journeyathon. I will link her and all of the relevant information down in the description. But her readathon focuses on middle grade. So I was able to read 4 middle grade stories. One was a fiction book and the other 3 were graphic novels. I'll divide my reading up between illustrated stuff, which includes graphic novels, comics, and manga, fiction, nonfiction, and plays and poetry. So if you're more interested in a certain topic, feel free to skip around. I'm going to start with my DNF, which I had one. It was called The Road to Roswell by Connie Willis. This was a brand new sci-fi release that was supposed to be incredibly funny. Connie Willis is known to be a funny sci-fi writer, and I thought she would be somewhat like John Scalzi, who was also a funny sci-fi writer. Unfortunately, her book was not at all funny. I DNF'd at 75 pages because I hadn't laughed or anything. The premise is that this woman goes to Roswell, New Mexico to be a part of her college roommate's wedding. The bride and groom are both really into aliens and are having their wedding during a alien-themed festival in Roswell. The friend does not believe in aliens or anything like that, but when she goes to get something out of her friend's car, she is kidnapped by an alien. The alien forces her to drive out into the middle of the desert, which she does, and when the alien is distracted, she attempts to call her friend, the bride, but her voicemail is full. So then she tries to call 911, and they think that this is just a prank, and they don't believe her and hang up. She then attempts to call somebody else, and it just felt really unrealistic. Like, calls take a while to get through, and she's in the middle of the desert. It made no sense that she wouldn't text or post on social media if she wanted help. Eventually, the alien catches her and destroys her phone, so there go her chances for rescue. As the alien makes her get back in the car and drive around some more, she sees a hitchhiker on the road, and she really tries to avoid picking him up because she doesn't want the alien to do anything to him. However, he jumps in front of the car and basically forces her to stop and pick him up. He does not have a phone, which just felt very unlikely. They continue on until they need to go to a gas station, and they come up with a plan that they will alert the authorities while the man tries to distract the alien. Unfortunately, that doesn't work either. There is nobody in the convenience store, and there is no phone available. This was just getting more and more implausible, and so I decided to check Goodreads and read a very spoilery review, and I'm glad I quit at 75 pages. They continue to add cast of characters also who don't have phones, and get into these really boring scrapes. Like, at no point was I laughing or smirking or anything, so I gave it up. Okay, so let's switch to illustrated stuff. I picked up Garlic and the Vampire by Brie Paulson. This is a cute middle grade story about a witch who gardens, and she has kind of magicked some of these vegetables to be anthropomorphic. They are like little people, basically. The witch and the vegetables see smoke in a nearby castle, and it's rumored that there's a vampire. All of the other vegetables decide to nominate Garlic to go deal with said vampire, but she is a ball of nerves. She's just an anxious mess. She eventually does make the journey over to the castle, and I won't tell you what happens next because there's not a huge amount of plot. I did think this was really cute, and I did like it. However, I didn't like it enough to feel drawn to pick up the second book yet. So I gave it 3 stars. It was enjoyable. I decided to pick up the second book in the trilogy, The Legends of Zeta the Space Girl by Ben Hatka. In this one, we follow Zeta and some people that she has met. They find a technology that they thought was no longer available and get to use said technology to help save the day. This was very fast-paced sci-fi. There's lots of robots and different characters, aliens, and all sorts. It was very enjoyable. I gave it 3.5 stars. And I decided to round out the trilogy by reading The Return of Zeta the Space Girl by Ben Hatka. In this one, we get to meet up with some other characters that we were separated from, as well as learn new characters that were just so fun. I loved Femur and Ragpile. They were my favorite new characters. And yeah, this picks up right after the action of book 2, so I can't really share a whole lot, but I enjoyed this trilogy and gave it 3.5 stars as well. All right, switching on to fiction. I read an advanced reader copy of Bored to Death by C.J. Connor. This was a queer, cozy mystery focused on Ben, who has moved back to his hometown to help his ailing father run the board game shop. A dodgy collector tries to sell him what is seemingly a very valuable, rare board game, but Ben is suspicious and he does not buy it. Later, the man who was trying to sell it to him ends up murdered, stabbed through the heart, and drops dead on the front porch of the board game shop. Ben and the florist next door, Ezra, are romantically interested in one another and were each other's very solid alibis, but they decide that they need to investigate the murder or else it might look like Ben did it. This book really just wasn't very plausible for me. I did do a single review that I will link up here and in the and in the description below. There were quite a few inconsistencies, and the story just didn't feel very plausible. Of course, if that doesn't matter to you, you might very well enjoy it, but I only gave it 2 stars. For my reread this month, I reread How to Be a Normal Person by T.J. Klune. This is probably one of my favorite T.J. Klune books. We focus on Gustavo Tiberius, a 30-something-year-old man who is very eccentric, very quirky. It's not explicitly said, but he is likely on the autism spectrum. He has been kind of living his life on autopilot since his dad, who was also his best friend, has died. He works at a video game rental he works at a movie rental store. He is friends with these 3 elderly bikers and also has a routine of going to the coffee shop. He walks into a coffee shop and instead of the woman who normally works there, he meets Casey, an asexual hipster who has moved to town to write a book. Gus is immediately infatuated with Casey and decides he needs to get the internet to find out how he can be a normal person and be able to woo and date Casey. This was actually the first book I ever read with asexual representation, and I think it's pretty good. So if you're looking for that, extra marks there as well. So Gus decides to get the internet, and he finds this message board of how to be normal. And these entries are incredibly hilarious. Let me share an example of one. You may not always feel confidence, but others can smell weakness like sharks can smell blood in the water. So while you may be meek and mild, let your inner lion roar and take charge of the situation. Using power phrases like, I've got this, and yes, I've been yachting before and had a marvelous time. Thank you for asking. Avoid phrases like, maybe we should, or if you think that's a good idea, or my grandmother sets my curfew and I can't be late, or she'll lock me in the broom closet again, as they could potentially make you look weaker. Appearing weak is definitely not normal, and you should avoid it at all costs. So I told you that Gus is quite quirky. He has a pet ferret named Harry S. Truman, and because the ferret likes to be wherever Gus is, he usually walks him around on a leash. And early on in the book, Gus goes to the store with his ferret and he sees Casey. And he gets so nervous and excited, but he tries to leave. But Harry S. Truman, his ferret, decides to lay down on the floor and he will not go. Gus has this really funny daydream, basically, where he envisions that Casey, because he's a hipster, is also into slam poetry and comes up with a poem he thinks that Casey would form from this interaction, and that was hilarious as well. I'll share it. I've seen, dramatic pause, man of my generation, pretending love and making war, pause for raucous applause. All the while, sweet, sweet mustard gas child, dragging ferrets through the store. I literally burst into laughter when I read that. That was just so funny because we had no indication that Casey is a poet or anything like this, but Gus just gets really imaginative. The characters are all wacky. Casey is a big pothead, and that gets into some silly, fun miscommunications and stuff. But at the heart of this is a happy gay love story, and so wholesome and sweet, and I love it. I did only give it 4 stars because upon my reread, I realized that Gus is a very stereotypical by making him a savant on movie trivia, and that felt fairly stereotypical, and so I knocked off a point for that. But enjoyment-wise, this is a 5. It's so fun. The fiction book I read for Journey-a-thon was A Pinch of Magic by Michelle Harrison. This was awesome. This was a fast-paced children's fantasy story focused on the Wittershin sisters. Their very strict grandma is raising them because their mother has died and their father is in prison. And they are not allowed to really go anywhere. And one day, Betty and her younger sister decide to sneak off to try and go to a festival that's nearby. But her grandma catches them and decides it's finally time to tell them about the curse. If they leave the island, they will be cursed and they will die, and which is one of the reasons she is so strict. She also lets them know about the 3 magical artifacts that they've been handing down in the family lineage, which I thought is like their little pinch of magic. So after finding out about the curse, Betty, the very headstrong middle sister, decides she's going to come up with a plan on how to break the curse. She makes a decision that sets off the whole book in terms of the plot, and it is just exciting, and I kept turning the pages because I kept wondering what was going to happen next. This was thrilling and fun, and I gave it 5 stars. I did want to share a couple of quotes that I thought were really good. Betty watched her pityingly. Some people did not need magic to be invisible. I thought that was a really good line. And I also really liked this one. But jealous, bitter people don't suddenly find that those feelings go away when what they envy becomes theirs. They simply find something else to be jealous and bitter about, because it was never about what the other person had, it was what they themselves lack. I thought that was great. There are 3 more books in this series, and I cannot wait to start the next one. I already have it on my August TBR. I also read Independence by Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni. And this was 5 stars. So good. This I read for the prompt to read about the India-Pakistan partition. This event that happened in 1947, the partition was when India became its own country. It was no longer a British colony. And the leaders in charge decided that they wanted to have 2 countries. One for Muslims and one for Hindus. They wanted the Muslims to live in Pakistan and the Hindus to live in India. There was tons of infighting, and so many people died or were injured or harmed during this great migration. Estimates are between 200,000 and 2 million people died from this. So this focuses on 3 Hindu sisters growing up with the partition as their background. The youngest daughter, Priya, is incredibly smart and wants to follow her father's footsteps by becoming a doctor. This is a very radical choice at the time, and women were consistently discriminated against in medical schools. They really didn't want women becoming doctors. And so this was a very extreme option for her during this time. We also focus on Jomini, the middle sister. She has a physical limp and is also uh, decides that she is going to be the loyal one. She's going to help her mother um, in situations, and because of her physical disability, she does not think that she will get a match. But she is incredibly jealous of her sister Priya because she has a best friend who is male, and he is from a wealthy family, and Jamini is in love with him. We also get the perspective of the oldest sister, Deepa, who is known as the beautiful one, and she has lots of options for who she could marry, but she falls in love with a Muslim man, which, as I explained before, was a very dangerous thing to do. So these three women come of age with the partition as the backdrop, and this is just such a rich and vivid story. These characters have just wormed their way into my brain, and they were amazing. And I found out she has quite a few books published already, so I'm definitely going to be seeking out her back catalog and finding out more of what she's written. Can't recommend this enough. The second 5-star was East of Eden by John Steinbeck. This was so good. When people call this like the perfect novel and John Steinbeck's best, I haven't read a whole lot of Steinbeck, but this, I can see why they would say that. It's so good. This is a hard book to talk about because it's this sprawling story through generations of these two families, and how these families basically unwittingly retell the story of Cain and Abel, brothers who couldn't get along and were constantly seeking their father's validation. These characters are so incredibly flawed but feel really realistic, and I just love them. This is definitely a slow character-based novel though, and it took me about 70 to 80 pages before I was really invested in the story. I think the book can be summed up by borrowing part from Wicked that says, "Are people born wicked, or do they have wickedness thrust upon them?" That that is exactly what the themes are looking at. Is, are people born evil, or is it the choices that they make that make them evil? I thought this was really good. I loved the ending. I thought it was perfect. I will say I listened to this on audiobook whilst reading with my eyes, and I will say it is jarring how many racist slurs are in here. There's a character only known as the N-word, and we also have Chinese characters who are uh, facing a lot of racism and slurs as well, which was quite jarring, but it seems realistic that it would be in this book for when it was written. But other than that, like, this was just such a joy. I highly recommend it, and I'm going to be picking up more John Steinbeck stories very soon. I had to read a poetry book, and I did a try a chapter poetry sampler video. I'll link up in the cards and in the description below, but I chose to continue on with The Hurting Kind by Ada Limon. I'm giving this 3 stars. I did like it. A lot of the poems, in my opinion, were kind of just fine. A few of them had lines that I really responded to, and I will share a few examples. From the poem Calling Things What They Are. Before, the only thing I was interested in was love. How it grips you, how it terrifies you, how it annihilates and resuscitates you. I didn't know then it wasn't even love that I was interested in, but my own suffering. I thought suffering kept things interesting. How funny that I called it love the whole time it was pain. And from a line from the poem Sanctuary, to be made whole by being not a witness, but witnessed. I liked that. This was a good collection, but I think maybe I'm not much of a poetry gal, so I probably won't be picking up much more in the future. Back in April, I got out of the library The Wager, Shipwreck, Murder, and Mutiny by David Grann. And I was just in the wrong mood to read nonfiction at that time. So I took it back to the library and got back in the back of the line. And I'm so glad I waited because I really enjoyed this and this was the right time for me to read it. David Grann has also written another narrative nonfiction called Killers of the Flower Moon. And I read that a few years ago. And I really enjoyed it. He is a very good narrative nonfiction writer. So we follow a British ship called the Wager. They are setting out and they are trying to attack Spanish ships and get their gold, essentially. But the Wager just has all sorts of setbacks. When they first dock, a lot of men defect and just leave. And so they have to go out and kidnap more men just so they can run the ship. And some of those men that were sent out to kidnap people took that opportunity to leave as well. So they needed even more people to kidnap. There were also things called shipworms, which were like up to 12 inches long, and they rotted away a lot of the wood in the ships. That had to be reinforced before they were able to sail. And once they finally got started, they were afflicted incredibly by scurvy. A lot of the symptoms caused some kinds of madness as well. And so many people died, including the captain. So a very inexperienced man became the captain instead. During rough seas, trying to go around the tip of South America, the storms were ferocious and they got dashed upon the rocks and had to take shelter on a very uninhabitable island. The men were hungry, still fighting scurvy, and they started getting mutinous. And the captain, who was very inexperienced, decided he was going to shoot the person who he thought was trying to start this mutiny. But unfortunately, that just severed the trust in a lot of the men. And the group basically splits in two, some remaining loyal to the de facto captain and some wanting to basically get away from him and do their best to become rescued. This was incredibly thrilling, very well written, very much a page turner. I will say the reason it doesn't get 5 stars is because the last quarter kind of talks about the legalities and economic impacts of losing this ship and withholding pay for the sailors and talking about the implications of the murder and the mutiny, which I found a little bit less interesting. But overall, I thought this was a great read. I gave it 4 stars and would highly recommend it if you like shipwreck stories. The last one that I read was Women We Buried, Women We Burned by Rachel Louise Snyder. This is Rachel Louise Snyder's memoir of growing up. I read her nonfiction book that came out a few years ago, No Visible Bruises, and thought it was exquisitely written and very well done. And when I found out she had a memoir coming out, I was so excited. She starts out the memoir by talking about, as a little kid, how her mom was always sick. And she had always just kind of expected her mom to be sick. And one day she comes home and the EMTs are there. And this wasn't uncommon for her, but she kept noticing the fact that the EMTs were not loading her mother up and getting her to the hospital. This is when she first noticed that something was different. And unfortunately, the reason it was different was because her mother had died. I want to share a quote from this. But another part of me is frozen forever in 1977, a girl with her young mother. Sometimes, as I watch the reel in my mind, I understand what any viewer would also immediately glean, that we lose them both in that moment, the woman and the girl. I read once how trauma freezes a person in time so that a part of them remains tethered to the person they were at the time of that trauma. Somewhere inside me, I am forever 8 years old. She also says, later I would train myself to cry in public when I knew I stood to gain something. Extra dessert, say, or a later bedtime, or a sleepover, some kind of attention. But I did not cry privately. Her death simmered inside me, an eternal gloaming. I thought that was really beautiful. She points out that her mother was Jewish, and shortly after her mother dies, her father remarries an evangelical Christian woman, and he forces the whole family to convert. This put a lot of fear in her because they weren't very religious before this point. She says, not doing Saturday chores, for example, which was the sin of disobedience, made questionable our status vis-a-vis the rapture. If it came in the hour of our disobedience, we wouldn't be ready, and we might well get left behind. Having been left behind by one parent already, the thought of being left behind by my entire family, even a family I didn't particularly like, overwhelmed me with fear. So she really struggles with this conversion that their family has. She struggles with hearing that rapists and murderers, robbers, all sorts of sinners can be saved if before they die, they confess their sins and become a Christian, and then they can go to heaven. And she really struggles because her mother was Jewish and she did not pray this prayer. And so these beliefs were telling her that her mother was suffering in hell. She also then is, at 13, sexually assaulted by her stepsister's boyfriend, who is 19. And this scene really broke my heart. It says, hoping whatever he was trying to do would be over soon, my body was jerking out of its own control. It was like slipping down a mountain of ice, desperately grabbing for anything to temper the velocity. My father would never forgive me for this. I had to be silent because however bad this was, I thought it would be less bad than if my dad found us. And unfortunately, that is the thought that a lot of religious people have, that they blame themselves for things that aren't their fault. And this is a book about trauma. Trauma losing a parent, trauma from religion, and trauma from the schism that happens within her own family. She is kicked out when she's a teenager, and she's just forced to kind of find her own way. She starts traveling and really starts to try and figure out what she's good at and what she can do to support herself. And she finds out that she loves writing. This was an incredibly powerful read. It was poignant and inspiring, and the strength and resilience that she had as a kid going through all of this was just, it was amazing to read. I will say it is a very triggering book, so please look up trigger warnings if you're sensitive, but I definitely recommend this book. I gave it 5 stars, and I'm buying my own copy very soon. Okay, so July was a great reading month. 3 5 stars. I'm so excited by that. Yeah. If every month could be that good, I would love it. Tell me, what did you read in the month of July? Tell me your worst or your best book that you read. Let's have a chat about it down in the comments below. Thank you for joining. Bye.